Cedar Creek Medical's ICU smells of antiseptic and something underneath it, something like copper and rain. The fluorescent lights hum their mechanical song above 20 beds, each one occupied, each one a story that Margaret Walsh has already begun reading before she checks the monitors. She pulls her third double shift this week, and her silver hair, pinned back with a clip that has been the same for 18 years, catches the light as she moves between rooms with a kind of efficiency that looks lazy to people who don't understand precision. Her scrubs are coffee-stained at the left hip, a mark from the break room at midnight when she stopped for exactly 4 minutes to drink something black and hot. No one notices that her hands move with a rhythm that belongs in field hospitals, not in the clean quiet of a Denver ICU. No one notices the way her fingers find a vein without hesitation, the way she adjusts for flow rates with the muscle memory of someone who learned on people who were bleeding out under a sun that tried to kill you. Room 347 is where Travis Mendez waits for his voice to come back, though the doctors say it won't. Not completely. His throat is reconstructed now, after 3 months of surgery and waiting, but the vocal cords took damage that medicine can read but not fix. He sits upright in bed at 8:56 p.m. on a Tuesday, his arm visible above the blanket, and on that arm, there is a tattoo. Faded. Ink that has been under skin long enough that it looks watercolored, imprecise, like a memory written in the language of the body. M. Walsh. 2 letters and a surname. Beneath them, crossed rifles. Margaret stands in his doorway for exactly 2 seconds longer than routine protocol requires, and her jaw tightens in a way that no one else would recognize as anything other than the fatigue of a nurse on hour 23 of a double shift. Mendez doesn't recognize her. His traumatic brain injury took Baghdad from him, took the explosion that shredded his throat and most of what came before it, and now he looks at this nurse with kind eyes that don't know who she is. Margaret moves into the room and checks his monitors with the focus of someone executing a classified assignment, because that is what this is. Not routine ICU protocol. Not the basic care you provide to patients recovering from reconstructive surgery. This is surveillance work that the hospital administration will never see on paper, never hear in a meeting, work that lives in the space between Margaret's civilian credentials and the clearance that got buried in systems that were supposed to stay buried. Her security clearance is high enough that when she fills out hospital forms, certain fields just disappear. Mendez watches her with eyes that don't remember, and Margaret adjusts his for flow rate, her fingers steady despite the slight tremor in her left hand when she thinks no one is watching. That tremor is not fear. That tremor is restraint. That tremor is 18 years of holding something inside so tightly that sometimes it tries to escape through her hands. She speaks to him with her voice pitched low, professional, the kind of calm that medical school teaches but only field experience makes real. Check this for me, okay? Any pain in the surgical site? He shakes his head. His eyes stay on her face like he is trying to remember something that was stolen from him. In her locker, in the basement where 3 other nurses change clothes and don't speak much, there is a jacket. Inside the lining, sewn with black thread in stitches the size of a pinhead, there is a patch. Faded. 10th Special Forces. The color has gone from a vibrant tan and black to something that looks like an old photograph of itself. Margaret sewed that patch into the jacket's lining before Mendez got medevaced out of Kandahar Air Base, back when he still had a voice, back when he knew her name and would call it out across compounds in that way that soldiers call out to people they trust with their lives. She left it there on purpose. A reminder. A tether. A thing that was supposed to stay hidden forever. That was until Dr. Pierce started paying attention. Pierce arrives for evening rounds at 9:14 p.m., his footsteps announcing him before his voice does, shoes on tile that click with the precision of someone who knows he owns the room. He is 47 years old, educated at schools that cost money Margaret will never have, possessed of the kind of face that photographs well and the kind of voice that makes people believe things that aren't true. His eyes scan room 347 the way a shark scans water for disturbance. He sees Margaret standing beside Mendez's bed, her hand still on the fall line, and something shifts in his expression. Not suspicion yet. Just notation. The kind of mental filing that happens when a man whose entire existence depends on controlling information notices someone paying attention to a patient in a way that exceeds the minimum requirement of her job description. Pierce has been committing fraud for 14 months. Not small fraud. Not the kind where you bill for extra gauze or charge for procedures that didn't happen. Pierce's fraud is architectural. It is the construction of phantom patients, admissions that exist only in paperwork, insurance claims that get paid and routed through accounts that belong to people who don't know they own them. $34,000 a month, which is not enough money to get you arrested but is enough money to make the risk calculation seem worth it. Enough money to buy a house in Cherry Creek, to put a down payment on a Tesla, to finance the kind of life that his salary as a hospitalist doesn't actually support. The hospital's new electronic record system is going to go live in 4 weeks. New security protocols. Automatic flags for duplicate entries. Cross-reference verification against Medicare databases. And when that system comes online, his phantom patients are going to disappear, which means the billing codes are going to be flagged, which means a compliance review is going to be triggered, which means everything unravels. But that is a problem for the new system. Right now, the problem is Margaret Walsh. Pierce has noticed that Margaret has a security clearance. He noticed it during her onboarding 3 months ago, back when Human Resources was still processing her employment file. She has a clearance that is higher than his, higher than the hospital security officer, higher than anyone should have for a position that requires you to change linens and dispense medications. When the electronic record system goes live, automatic security protocols are going to cross-reference all staff with federal databases, and high-clearance individuals are going to get flagged for a different kind of scrutiny. If Margaret is military, or intelligence, or anything connected to the Department of Defense, then her file is going to be examined. Her work patterns are going to be reviewed. Her access logs are going to be audited. Which means his billing scheme is going to be examined. Which means everything he has built in 14 months of systematic fraud is going to collapse like a building made of paper. Margaret doesn't know that Pierce has done the math. She doesn't know that he has already begun to calculate the probability of her becoming a liability. She only knows that when she looks up from Mendez's for line, Dr. Pierce is standing in the doorway with an expression that is perfectly neutral and perfectly wrong. He watches her for 3 seconds. She watches him for 2. Then she adjusts Mendez's blanket with her left hand, and Pierce's eyes track the motion like a predator tracking tremor in tall grass. The room went dead silent except for the ventilator's wheeze and the tick of the 4 pump, and in that silence, everything changed. Pierce's eyes tracked the motion like a predator calculating distance. He stood at the ICU nurse's station the following morning, surgical rounds scheduled, 8 resident physicians clustered around him in their pressed white coats. Margaret had finished her medication prep. She was moving toward room 347 when Pierce's voice cut through the ambient hum of monitors and ventilators. "Nurse Walsh." Not a question. A summons. "Your documentation." He held her chart notes aloft, pages yellowed against his manicured fingers. The residents turned in unison. Margaret felt their attention like a spotlight but kept walking. Pierce continued anyway, voice pitched to Carrie. "This is what I call museum-era nursing. Narrative notes. Long-form observations. Did they teach you computers in nursing school, or was that before electricity?" A resident laughed, the kind of laugh that wasn't quite genuine, the kind you offer a superior whether the joke lands or not. 47 minutes with patient in 347. "We're running an ICU, not a grief counseling session. Modern protocols demand efficiency. Documentation, efficiency, care distribution. Some of our veteran staff haven't quite adapted to the pace." Margaret's jaw tightened. A microscopic tension that rippled through the muscles beneath her skin and disappeared. Her hands remained steady as she adjusted the 4-pump flow rate on Mendez's line, 12 milliliters per hour, pharmaceutical precision. She didn't turn. She didn't defend herself. She walked past Pierce as though he'd commented on the weather, her scrubs whispering against the tile floor in a rhythm that could almost be meditation. But the words had landed. She felt them settle like shrapnel, the way dangerous things do. 3 days later, the vending machine incident. 3rd floor break room, 10:22 a.m., Margaret retrieving her coffee from the machine, the black kind, no sugar, nothing fancy. Two younger nurses stood nearby, residents on a rotation through the ICU. Pierce materialized like he'd been waiting, which he probably had been. His voice carried the kind of casual concern that wasn't concern at all. "I'm genuinely worried about our older nurses," Pierce said, addressing the residents but speaking loud enough for Margaret to hear. Technology moves fast. Protocols evolve. Some people have the plasticity to adapt. Others, they get left behind. It's not a judgment, it's just biology. He turned slightly, ensuring Margaret caught the performance. Some brains are more rigid after a certain age. Less receptive to new information. You see it in every hospital. The veterans who can't evolve. By the time they understand the system's already changed. The younger nurses exchanged glances. Margaret's hand didn't shake as she took her coffee from the slot. The cup was warm. Familiar. She turned, met Pierce's eyes for exactly 1 second, a cold flat stare that contained nothing he could read, and walked back toward the ICU. Behind her, she heard Pierce continue talking to the residents, his voice following her like smoke. That night, she couldn't sleep. She worked a double, then sat in her apartment on Federal Boulevard in Denver, watching rain streak the windows. The apartment was sparse. A bed. A desk. A photograph she kept turned face down on the nightstand. The faded 10th Special Forces unit patch was sewn inside her jacket lining, against the fabric where it would never be seen. She'd cut it from her uniform before the medevac, before the reconstruction, before she became someone who walked hospital corridors instead of mountain passes in Helmand Province. Pierce's words echoed. Rigid. Outdated. Can't evolve. The problem with assumptions is that they made people predictable. Predictable people made mistakes. Mistakes exposed schemes. And Pierce had a scheme that required Margaret's removal before the hospital's new electronic records system went live, for weeks now. Maybe 3. The following Monday brought the schedule change. Margaret arrived for her shift and found the roster altered. All her regular ICU allies, Keisha, Rodriguez, Thompson, the core team that had worked alongside her for 8 months, reassigned to nights. Effective immediately. Margaret's name appeared alone on the day's shift, partnered with residents so new they were still learning where the supply closets were. The message was clear: isolation precedes termination. She said nothing. She accepted the assignment and worked the day's shift with mechanical precision, her hand steady, her voice measured. But in the pharmacy at 4 p.m., she saw Pierce entering an administrator's office down the corridor. The door didn't close completely. His voice carried through the gap. 3 board members. That's all I need. I'm documenting everything. Inefficient time management. Questionable judgment with patients. A liability the hospital can't afford. Pause. By the time we're ready to move, we'll have the paper trail. Margaret continued walking, her medication tray balanced, her face revealing nothing. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the physical manifestation of 18 years of control learned in Baghdad, refined in 100 situations where showing emotion meant death, control that had become so absolute that even her own heart couldn't betray her. Tuesday, the medication errors appeared in Mendez's chart. 3 instances, wrong dosage times, incomplete documentation, the kind of subtle mistakes that accumulated into a pattern of concern. Margaret caught the first one during her afternoon rounds. Mendez's cardiac medications were logged at times that didn't match the actual administration. She corrected the records and left a note in the chart, but the damage was done. The pattern existed now. Evidence, even corrected, leaves a trail. Pierce had reassigned room 347 to a newer nurse. Care distribution, he'd said during rounds, his voice carrying the unmistakable condescension of someone making a policy decision that had nothing to do with policy. Margaret watched from across the ICU as the younger nurse fumbled with Mendez's line adjustment, waited too long to respond to an alarm, missed the subtle signs that Margaret had learned to read, the microscopic changes in breathing pattern that indicated pain, the slight tremor in his remaining hand that suggested anxiety. By Wednesday, Margaret's access to the electronic medical records system had been restricted. Training review, the administrator explained when she tried to pull up Mendez's latest labs. Dr. Pierce recommended it. You'll need to request patient information through him during your evaluation period. The trap was elegant. Isolate the subject. Remove access to information. Restrict communication with allies. Create documented patterns of inefficiency. Then terminate. It was a strategy that would have worked on someone without 18 years of classified operations experience, without a security clearance that sat dormant in the hospital database like an armed device nobody knew was ticking. Margaret moved through her rounds with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The kind of composure that belongs to people who've held dying soldiers in their arms, who've made life-or-death decisions under fire, who understand that most people's crises are just Tuesday afternoon. She checked on Mendez, noticed his elevated heart rate, 162 beats per minute, tachycardia stemming from the new nurse's slower response times. She adjusted his medication through the pharmacy system, documented everything with her usual precision, and continued working. At 2 a.m., during her final medication rounds, Margaret locked herself in the supply closet for exactly 4 minutes. The space was small, industrial, lined with boxes of gauze and saline and all the disposable materials that an ICU consumed at a rate that never quite matched supply ordering. She stood in front of the metal cabinet where they stored the sterile field kits. Her reflection stared back, dark eyes, hair pulled tight, jaw set, the face of someone who'd lived 2 entirely different lives and had become very good at compartmentalizing both. The eyes were the problem. They'd seen too much. Fallujah, 2007. Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, 2010. A signals operator named Travis Mendez bleeding out in a Humvee while she applied pressure with her hands, whispering instructions to the pilot, get him to Bagram. 42 minutes. He doesn't have 43. The Defense Intelligence Agency didn't assign protection details to people who didn't matter. Mendez had been exposed to classified signals intelligence before the IED shredded his throat. Foreign operatives would absolutely try to approach him during recovery, extract whatever remained in his memory, determine what he'd communicated before the injury, eliminate the liability. Margaret's job was simple: keep him alive and keep him isolated from threats. Her cover as an ICU nurse was perfect because ICU nurses had unlimited access to patients, legitimate reasons to monitor vitals, documentation that explained her presence better than any security detail could. Pierce had no idea what he was dismantling. He saw an outdated nurse who didn't fit the modern hospital. He didn't see a captain with 3 tours, a Bronze Star with Valor, medical certifications obtained through 18 months of classified training. He didn't see the patch hidden in her jacket lining, the reminder that some missions never really ended, just transformed into different uniforms. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what made her stand motionless in the supply closet at 2 a.m., breathing steady, trying to solve a problem that had no clean resolution. The hospital's new electronic record system was scheduled to go live in 3 weeks. 7 days from now, the system would undergo its first comprehensive security audit, scanning every personnel file, cross-referencing every clearance status. When it did, Margaret's classified security clearance would appear in the database like a flag on a map. The system would automatically notify the Defense Department's Personnel Security Division. Notifications triggered investigations. Investigations meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant her cover would detonate, the operation would collapse, and Mendez would be vulnerable to every operative who'd been waiting for him to surface. But if she did nothing, if she allowed Pierce to move forward with her termination, she'd lose access to the patient entirely. She'd lose the ability to monitor his recovery, detect threats, keep him alive. Pierce would remove her from the ICU, and then the people she'd been trained to watch for would come. She was trapped between 2 catastrophes, exposure and abandonment. The metal cabinet door reflected her face, and she didn't recognize the person staring back. The person in the reflection had made mistakes. The person in the reflection had gotten too close to the patient, lingered too long by his room, let Pierce see something in her expression that triggered his predatory instinct. That was the terrible calculus of undercover work. The closer you got to the mission, the more you looked like the person you were supposed to be. And sometimes, that made you visible to people hunting for exactly what you were hiding. Margaret left the supply closet at 2:04 a.m., returned to her medication rounds, and continued working as though nothing in her world had just fractured. Her hands remained steady. Her documentation remained precise. Her face revealed nothing of the countdown that had begun the moment Pierce decided she needed to disappear. Monday morning at Cedar Creek Medical arrived with the kind of quiet that precedes something terrible. Margaret pushed through the ICU doors at 6:45, her badge already feeling heavier than it had 2 days ago, and stopped in front of the staffing board. Her name had been repositioned. Again. Night shift. 22 to 6 o'clock. Not her regular rotation. Not anywhere near Mendez's peak monitoring window when his vitals were most volatile, when foreign operatives, if they came, would make their move in the gaps between rounds. She didn't move for 7 seconds. Her hands didn't tremble. Her jaw didn't clench visibly. She simply read the board the way a sniper reads wind direction, collecting data, understanding what Pierce had just executed. Her allies, nurses Chen and Rodriguez, the 2 staff members who'd been rotating through Mendez's care with her, now appeared on the night roster. Chen's name had been shifted to 21 to 5 o'clock. Rodriguez to 22:30 to 6:30. The surgical tech who'd been present during Mendez's dressing changes, displaced. Her protective perimeter, systematically dismantled. Not by shouting. Not by confrontation. By paperwork. By the careful manipulation of a scheduling system that no administrator would question because it appeared, on its surface, perfectly reasonable. Load balancing. Staff rotation. Standard practice. This was Pierce's true power, not bluster but institutional architecture. Not the hammer but the blueprint. Margaret walked to the break room, poured coffee she wouldn't drink, and pulled out her phone. One encrypted message to her handler at the Defense Intelligence Agency would trigger immediate reassignment. One call and she'd be extracted within 4 hours. The Pentagon didn't leave people on compromised stations. But extraction meant Mendez would remain unguarded. Means no protective detail around a signals operator whose classified knowledge made him a target worth killing. Foreign intelligence services didn't move fast on hospitalized targets, they moved methodically, waiting for isolation, waiting for the moment when a patient was most vulnerable and most unwatched. Pierce knew none of this. He knew only that Margaret's security clearance would detonate his billing fraud the moment Cedar Creek's new electronic records system went live in 3 weeks. He was behaving like an animal backed into a corner, not thinking strategically beyond his immediate survival, just lashing out with institutional weapons because he had them and she appeared defenseless. But Margaret had served 14 months in Baghdad as a military medical officer attached to the 10th Special Forces Group. She'd learned institutional manipulation in environments where the only paperwork was the body count. And she recognized, in Pierce's actions, the signature moves of someone who'd been trained in exactly these tactics, someone who understood that the best way to eliminate a person wasn't through confrontation but through systematic suffocation. Reassign her allies. Restrict her access. Create documentation that justified her removal. Let the system do the killing. Except Pierce hadn't learned those tactics in a war zone. He'd learned them at Cedar Creek Medical, where administrators had likely used them on him years ago, and where he'd absorbed them like a disease vector absorbs infection. At 8:15, Pierce made his first phone call. Margaret didn't hear it. She was in room 342, adjusting a patient's medication drip, but the ICU coordinator, Jenny, who sat 2 desks away from his office, mentioned it casually at the shift change. He's been on calls all morning. Sounded serious. Board member names, I think. At 10:30, the second call. Margaret was documenting patient vitals, her handwriting as precise as surgical stitching, when she heard Pierce's voice through the open door. What I'm describing to you is a pattern of scope creep. Outdated protocols. A nurse practicing beyond her credential level. His tone remained calm, almost mournful, a man describing a problem that troubled him deeply. I worry about our liability. The third call came at 12:45. Pierce sat in his office with the door closed this time, but his voice carried through the walls. "I've documented 3 incidents already. Medication errors in her charting. Unauthorized procedures. She's a patient safety risk." His voice sounded regretful, the voice of a man forced to report an uncomfortable truth. Margaret was in the supply closet, restocking wound dressings, when she heard that last sentence through the vent system. She didn't pause. Her hands continued organizing gauze pads, for X for S, 2X2S, Curlix wraps, with the same methodical precision she'd used 14 months ago in a forward operating base near Anbar province, packing supplies while mortar rounds hammered the perimeter. Her breathing remained steady. Her jaw remained unlocked. The trembling, if it had been present, would have been from training overload, not fear. Combat medics learn to compartmentalize. This was just a different kind of combat. By 2 p.m., Pierce had called 3 board members. The messaging was consistent: Margaret was a liability. She was performing procedures outside her scope. Her recent behavior had become erratic. Each call had been deferential, regretful, the voice of a concerned colleague trying to do the right thing. None of the calls mentioned her military background, her classified security clearance, or the fact that within 3 weeks an automated audit would flag her credentials and trigger a Defense Department investigation into Cedar Creek's records. Pierce didn't know those things existed. He was operating on a simpler calculation: remove Margaret from the hospital before her presence destabilized his operation. Margaret understood, with absolute clarity, that she was watching a master at work. This wasn't crude bullying. This was orchestrated institutional sabotage performed by someone who understood that the quietest way to destroy a person was to make the system destroy them. Paperwork. Telephone calls. Carefully worded concerns. By the end of the week, Margaret's name would appear in 3 separate board member notes as a liability. By the end of the month, she'd be terminated for cause. Her military cover would explode outward through the system during the background check. And Mendez would be unguarded for the 72 hours it took for her replacement to arrive, 72 hours during which a SVR operative with a syringe of potassium chloride could approach his room, inject his full line, and walk out past security footage that would show nothing but a visitor asking directions. Pierce had no idea what he was actually engineering. He thought he was protecting his fraud. He was actually enabling an international intelligence operation against a U.S. military asset. Margaret finished restocking the supply closet at 14:15, her movement smooth and unhurried. She checked her watch, a simple Timex, nothing that identified her, and walked toward room 347. Mendez's dressing change was scheduled for 14:30. His oxygen saturation had been holding at 94% as of the morning round. His reconstructed trachea was healing within normal parameters. It was supposed to be routine. It wasn't. She entered room 347 and found Mendez sitting upright, the morning light from the window making his scarred throat visible where the bandages had been changed. His tattoo, the one with her name and the crossed rifles, was barely visible beneath the sleeve of his hospital gown, a ghost beneath cotton. She checked his vitals: oxygen saturation 94%, heart rate 78, blood pressure 128/81. Everything normal. Everything that said the next 15 minutes would be unremarkable. She explained the procedure, knowing he couldn't answer, knowing he wouldn't remember her from Baghdad no matter how many times she performed this task. She'd made peace with that the first week. Some people you save and never get to meet twice. Margaret began removing the surgical dressing from his reconstructed trachea with the deliberate slowness of someone who understood that scar tissue could tear, that the body's repair mechanisms were fragile things, that 14 months of combat surgery had taught her the precise angle at which to lift gauze without compromising the wound. The antiseptic smell filled the space between them, sharp, clean, almost medicinal in its purity. Then everything changed. His breathing shifted. Not a cough. Not a conscious response. A mechanical failure. His respiratory pattern became shallow and rapid, the kind of breathing that belonged to bodies in distress. Margaret glanced at the monitor, saturation 88% and dropping. Scar tissue collapse. Tracheal stenosis. The reconstructed airway failing under its own weight. She didn't call for help. She moved. Her right hand found the emergency code button on the wall and pressed it with enough force to activate the entire ICU response sequence. Her left hand was already reaching for the emergency kit, fingers moving with the kind of certainty that comes from having performed a procedure in a Humvee moving 60 miles per hour through Baghdad's Jolan district while mortar rounds detonated 3 blocks away. Room 347 began filling with sound, the monitor screaming, Mendez's breathing becoming panicked gasps, her own voice calling out, tracheal collapse. His desaturating. I need an airway now. Nobody was coming fast enough. His oxygen saturation hit 82%. His lips were beginning to turn blue, that particular shade of blue that meant hypoxia, meant brain cells dying, meant she had approximately 90 seconds to restore oxygen flow or lose the patient permanently. Margaret pulled a scalpel from the emergency kit. Not a thought process. Not a decision tree. Muscle memory from 14 months as a medical officer with the 10th Special Forces Group, from 100 procedures performed on bodies that couldn't consent because they were unconscious, from the absolute understanding that a living, breathing patient was preferable to a dead one regardless of procedure legality. She found the cricothyroid membrane with the precision of someone who'd done this in worse light, with worse conditions, with worse outcomes looming. Her blade moved with fluid certainty. One incision. The hiss of air escaping his lungs as the tissue released pressure. An emergency cricothyrotomy performed in a Denver hospital by a nurse with military medical training she'd never documented, never mentioned, never disclosed to human resources. The crash cart burst through the door at the same moment the saturation monitor began climbing. 75%. 82%. 88%. The code team saw her standing over Mendez with a scalpel in her hand, blood on her glove, his airway now open and breathing. Her face remained blank. Her hands remained steady. Pierce appeared in the doorway, and Margaret watched his expression transform. Not surprise. Not even anger. Something deeper, the expression of a man watching his entire strategy detonate in real time. A nurse, performing surgery. A nurse, with surgical precision. A nurse, with knowledge and experience and training that no standard ICU credential should contain. She met his eyes for precisely 2 seconds. Long enough for him to understand. Long enough for understanding to morph into something resembling fear. Then she turned back to Mendez, who was breathing now, whose oxygen saturation was climbing toward normal range, whose pupils were already responding to light. She washed the blood from her hands under the sink in room 347, and when she looked back, Pierce had vanished. Mendez's oxygen saturation began dropping at 1430. The monitor showed it first, a number sliding backward like a hand closing around a throat. 94%. 91%. 88%. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, indifferent to the crisis unfolding inside the young man's chest. Margaret was charting at the nurse's station when the alarm registered in her muscle memory before her conscious mind acknowledged the sound. She moved toward room 347 without deciding to move. The body remembers what the cover identity tries to forget. Inside the room, Mendez's chest rose and fell in synchrony with the machine, but his eyes were wide. Awake. Aware that something inside him was collapsing. The reconstructed trachea, the surgical pathway she'd examined 3 times daily for 6 weeks, was failing. The edema had returned. The grafted tissue was swelling inward, choking off his airway like a closing fist. Oxygen sat 84%. Then 82%. Margaret pulled the crash cart toward the bedside in one fluid motion. Her hands already knew what she needed before her voice could command them. She didn't call for backup. She didn't wait for the code team. Pain was information. Fear was data. And the data screaming from Mendez's monitor told her he had approximately 4 minutes before his brain began dying. She found the scalpel on the crash cart where it lived, where it had lived for 30 years in operating theaters from Fallujah to Kandahar. Her fingers closed around it the way a musician finds a violin in darkness. "Cricothyrotomy," she said, not to anyone in particular. Just stating what was about to happen. "Scalpel." She was already holding it. "Prep the field." Her hands moved on their own. Anatomy is architecture, and Margaret had built this same pathway through human tissue 1,000 times in 1,000 wars. She palpated the space between Mendes's cricoid and thyroid cartilage, the membrane no thicker than a piece of paper, and her knowledge of his body became absolutely certain. This was the only pathway that would save him. This was the only truth that mattered. The scalpel went in horizontally. Precise. One cut. Just through the membrane. The blade sang against the cartilage the way steel sings when it knows exactly what it's meant to do. Blood appeared, not a fountain, just a thin line of truth, and she had the 7.5 endotracheal tube inserted before the bleeding could become a problem. She fixed it in place with surgical tape, and the tube began delivering oxygen directly to his lungs, bypassing the failing trachea entirely. Oxygen saturation climbed. 84, 88. 92, the monitor steadied into normal rhythm, and Mendes's pupils constricted as oxygen returned to his brain. His eyes found Margaret's, and in that moment, he was still himself. Still alive. Still hers to protect. 13 seconds. That's how long the entire procedure took. She'd done it in less time in a burning field hospital outside Fallujah while explosions walked up the walls like angry footsteps. That's when Pierce appeared in the doorway. He froze the way civilians freeze when they see something they're not equipped to understand. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Margaret washed Mendes's blood from her hands under the sink in the corner of room 347, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd performed this action 100 times before. The water ran pink, then clear. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. Everything about her belonged in an operating room in Baghdad, not an ICU in Denver. Pierce's face cycled through expressions like a broken projector. First confusion. Then recognition. Then something uglier, the expression of a man watching his entire strategic calculation collapse in real time. He'd been so focused on her age, her title, her supposed obsolescence, that he'd missed the fundamental truth about Margaret Walsh. He'd seen a tired nurse. He'd missed the surgeon. He'd missed the operator. He'd missed everything that mattered. That's... Pierce's voice cracked. "You can't." "Patient stabilized," Margaret said. Her voice had dropped an octave. "No please. No apology. Just fact delivered the way officers deliver orders to soldiers who are about to die. His primary trachea is edematous. This tube bypasses it. He needs to stay sedated for 72 hours while the swelling recedes. After that, we attempt extubation." Pierce's jaw worked without producing sound. A nurse, an ICU nurse, had just performed a surgical procedure that belonged to trauma surgeons. A procedure that required training he couldn't even name. A procedure that exposed something about Margaret Walsh that he'd been too busy humiliating to notice. The crash team arrived 30 seconds later, bursting through the door like they'd been running. They stopped cold. Margaret stood beside the bed with Mendes's chart in one hand and absolute authority in her posture. The tube was in place. The patient was stable. The crisis was already over. What happened? The trauma surgeon, Dr. Reeves, who actually knew what he was looking at, stepped forward with immediate understanding. "Airway collapse from graft rejection," Margaret said. "Presented at 14:30 with rapid desaturation. Emergency cricothyrotomy at 14:31. Saturation now 96% and holding. Patient alert and responsive." Reeves looked at the tube. Looked at Margaret. Looked at the precision of the placement, the kind of placement that required a hand that had spent decades learning the exact angle of a needle through membrane, the exact pressure needed, the exact knowledge of anatomy that comes only from having done this while people were trying to kill you. "Who performed this?" Reeves asked. Margaret met his eyes. Necessary measure. Patient was for minutes from cerebral hypoxia. No attending available. I stabilized per field medicine protocols. There was a pause. The kind of pause that happens when the world is deciding whether to accept a new version of reality. Then Reeves nodded slowly, the kind of nod a surgeon gives when he understands that someone in that room had training he couldn't quite place but absolutely recognized. Pierce was still in the doorway. His hands had balled into fists. His face had gone the color of old concrete. "Step back," Margaret said to him. Not a request. An order delivered with the same tone she'd used when she directed his hospital staff. His jaw tightened, but his body obeyed, his feet carrying him backward and out of the doorway. Margaret turned her attention to Mendez. His eyes were beginning to close as the sedatives from the crash team's medication started working. She leaned down so only he could see her. "You're going to sleep now," she said. "When you wake up, you'll be able to breathe again. I promise." She didn't know if he understood her words, but his pupils found her face one more time, and his breathing, the breathing that came through the tube she'd placed with her own hands, steadied as if her voice alone was medication. The room filled with people then. Orders being called. Equipment being wheeled in. The choreography of a hospital responding to crisis. Margaret stepped back and let them work. She'd done her job. The only thing that mattered now was that Mendez was alive. The only thing that mattered was that her cover was blown open like shrapnel in the afternoon light. Pierce had seen everything. 1 hour. That's how long it took for security to escort Margaret from the ICU to the third-floor administrative office, the badge she'd worn for 8 months already confiscated, her access credentials revoked before she'd even finished drying her hands. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical dirge as she walked, her scrub still bearing the faint copper stain of Mendez's blood, the only visible proof that she'd just saved his life. Pierce had moved faster than she'd anticipated. That was the mistake she'd made, underestimating a cornered man with everything to lose. HR Director Susan Chen's office smelled like recycled air and the particular staleness of spaces where difficult conversations happened regularly. Margaret sat across from a woman whose expression had been carefully constructed to convey professional regret, the kind of sympathy that came from scripts rather than conviction. Pierce stood near the window, his white coat still pristine, his face arranged in an expression of concerned sincerity that made Margaret's jaw tighten by a millimeter, the only crack in her composure, and only visible to someone trained to see such things. Which Pierce was not. "I want to be clear," Pierce began, his voice carrying the calibrated tone of a man delivering a foregone conclusion. "Captain Walsh performed an unauthorized surgical procedure without attending physician approval, without proper informed consent documentation, and without establishing appropriate chain of command for an emergency intervention. That's outside her scope of practice. That's reckless." He placed a folder on Chen's desk with the precision of a chess player delivering checkmate. "I have incident reports from 3 nurses who witnessed the breach. Her behavior suggests escalating instability." Margaret said nothing. Silence was a weapon she understood the way most people understood speech. Chen cleared her throat, uncomfortable in the way civilians became when they sensed the presence of something larger than hospital politics. "Ms. Walsh, Dr. Pierce is recommending we report this to the State Board of Nursing. That's within our obligations as a hospital. Your actions, while potentially life-saving, violated multiple protocols regarding physician authority and—" "Captain Walsh," Margaret corrected, her voice dropping an octave. "Not Ms. Nom. Captain." The room went still. Chen blinked, her pen hovering mid-note. Pierce's expression shifted microscopically, a tightening at the corner of his mouth that suggested he'd heard something in that correction that his civilian education had never prepared him to understand. Authority. Not requested. Simply stated. "I performed a field cricothyrotomy on a patient experiencing complete airway obstruction with no attending physician present and no time for departmental procedures," Margaret continued, each word calibrated like rounds in a magazine. "The patient's oxygen saturation was 48. Field conditions required immediate intervention. The procedure is within ACLS guidelines for emergency airway management when standard methods have failed. I saved his life. She paused. One beat. That's my scope. Pierce leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. Captain, I'm going to be direct. I'm recommending to the State Nursing Board that your credentials be suspended pending investigation. An unauthorized surgical procedure goes beyond scope of practice. It's grounds for license revocation. He smiled thinly, and in that smile Margaret saw exactly what he believed, that he'd cornered her, that her classified cover was about to be shredded by official inquiry, that her 8-month defense intelligence operation would collapse the moment state investigators requested her military background check. I'm also requesting that hospital security escort you from the premises immediately. He didn't know. That was the problem. He had no idea that reporting Margaret's credentials to the State Nursing Board would trigger exactly the automatic Defense Department notification that would expose everything, the classified clearance, the DIA assignment, the entire operation. He'd chosen the one action guaranteed to activate every alarm bell in a system designed to protect assets like her. Pierce had just handed her the rope, and he was about to watch himself hang with it. But understanding that knowledge changed nothing about the immediate moment. It changed nothing about what his action would do to Mendez. Chen shifted uncomfortably. The hospital will be cooperating fully with any state inquiry. We've already documented the incident. Security will escort you to retrieve your personal items from your locker. After that, you're to leave the premises and not return until the investigation is concluded. Margaret stood. Her movements were smooth, economical, the kind of precise motion that came from years of operating in spaces where hesitation meant death. The scrub she'd worn for 200 consecutive hours, the badge she'd swiped 5,000 times, the locker she'd filled with the careful props of a civilian life, all of it was being systematized into evidence of incompetence. All of it was disappearing. She watched without expression as security officers with soft eyes and hard protocols led her through corridors she'd learned like a map of her own body. 3 left turns, past the pharmacy where Tommy always saved her coffee, past the break room where she'd memorized the locations of every camera and every blind spot. The younger nurses averted their eyes. That was the hardest part, not the humiliation, not the termination, but the fact that her colleagues already believed she'd done something wrong, that their silence was complicity disguised as professional distance. Her locker was small, institutional, impersonal as a grave. 3 months of accumulated items, a spare stethoscope, a collection of compression socks, the folded army physical fitness uniform jacket she'd kept as a backup, a paperback novel she'd never opened. All of it went into a cardboard box with the weight of evidence. A security officer named Marcus, who'd always nodded when she passed, held the box awkwardly, unable to meet her eyes. Pierce appeared in the hallway, his expression a carefully calculated mixture of professional regret and triumph. I hope you understand, this isn't personal, he said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a man who'd just destroyed someone and needed the world to know it hadn't bothered him. It's about maintaining institutional standards. Margaret took the box from Marcus. She looked at Pierce with eyes that had watched men die in alleys in Kandahar, that had held battlefield medical rags against exit wounds, that had learned to calculate survival probabilities while enemy rounds whistled overhead. She didn't speak. Speech was unnecessary. The silence between them was the sound of an entire history of underestimation, a man seeing only an older woman in scrubs, missing the for combat deployments, the Bronze Star citation he'd never find in any hospital personnel file, the calluses on her hands that came from holding lives together through blood and morphine and the kind of desperation that civilian medicine never encountered. She walked past him toward the elevator. The rain started at 11 o'clock that night, fat drops that hammered the parking lot like applause or accusation. Margaret had learned to distinguish between the two long ago. She sat in a diner on Colfax Avenue, its windows fogged from the thermal pressure of bad coffee and worse lighting, her untouched cup spreading cold ripples across the laminate table. Ambulance lights strobed through the glass, red and blue and red again, painting her reflection in stuttering intervals, solid, then ghost, then solid again. A woman without a hospital badge. A woman without clearance. A woman without a mission. The mathematics was simple and terrible. Mendes had been her assignment, her only window into a target requiring protection until his security status could be upgraded or downgraded or transferred to someone else. She'd spent 8 months building the relationship, establishing the cover, positioning herself as the one person he would trust when the bad people arrived, and the bad people would arrive, because mute soldiers with classified exposure were valuable commodities on markets that didn't advertise themselves. She was his firewall against extraction. She was also, now, officially terminated from the hospital and about to be flagged by the State Nursing Board, which would trigger her Defense Department clearance review, which would expose her entire operational status to the very people she'd been designed to protect him from. Protecting her cover meant abandoning him. Blowing her cover meant losing him to agencies that would ask questions he couldn't answer. She picked up the cold coffee. Put it down. The waitress, a woman named Delia who'd served her 7 times in 2 weeks, didn't ask if she wanted anything else. Delia understood the language of people sitting alone in diners at 3 in the morning. Delia understood that some conversations happened in the spaces between words. Margaret made her decision between the 3rd and 4th ambulance siren. She wouldn't remain silent. Wouldn't protect an operation that left Mendes vulnerable. Wouldn't calculate the bureaucratic cost-benefit of one classified mission against the safety of a veteran whose only crime was surviving long enough to become a problem. She understood exactly what would happen. The Defense Department would mobilize, the DIA would activate its extraction protocols, the classified world would shake itself awake and discover that Captain Margaret Walsh had just pulled the fire alarm on 8 months of careful work. There would be consequences. Her career was already a casualty. The remaining question was whether Mendes would survive long enough for the institutional machinery to protect him. She left $30 on the table, more than the coffee cost, less than an apology. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the parking lot slick and reflective as a mirror. She walked toward her car, a 2008 Honda Civic registered to a civilian name, carrying a cardboard box containing the props of her cover identity. Behind her, the diner's neon sign reflected against the wet asphalt. The sound of traffic on Colfax Avenue continued its indifferent rhythm, the city's pulse, the background hum of a world that didn't know that everything had just changed beneath its surface. She didn't know that in exactly 42 minutes, the Defense Department's automated systems would flag Margaret Walsh's forced termination in the hospital's personnel database. She didn't know that by dawn, FBI agents would already be pulling 6 months of financial records on Dr. Pierce, tracing the patterns of phantom Medicaid patients and kickback payments to a durable medical equipment supplier that didn't actually supply equipment. She didn't know that her choice to blow her own cover would turn out to be the exact moment when the larger machinery finally woke up and realized it needed to move. All Margaret knew, in that moment between the diner and her car, was that she'd made the only choice that let her live with herself. Consequences be damned. The rain started again as she drove toward Walter Reed's secure facility, where Mendes would need protection that transcended normal hospital protocols, where the real fight was about to begin. If you've ever faced an impossible choice between your duty and someone who couldn't protect themselves, subscribe and let us know how you'd have handled it. What would you have done differently? Comment below, and like this video if you believe the quietest person in the room sometimes holds more power than anyone realizes.